Some genre fans don't like to have comedy mixed in with their horror. They feel that every horror movie should be a straightforward dramatic attempt to scare you, and some comedy fans won't go near a horror movie. But then there are those of us who feel that horror and comedy are two great flavors that taste great together, just like chocolate and peanut butter. Think of how people react when something scares them at a haunted house attraction, or when a scene in a movie makes them jump. Their screams are immediately followed by laughter. This is why horror and comedy go hand in hand. And we're going to look back at some of the best horror comedies of the 80s in this episode of 80s Horror Memories.
Oh my God! It's so interesting, like when I look through, the movies that I'm gravitating towards are horror comedies or horror that have comedy in them. Because I would argue, you can't have a comedy and sort of put a little horror in. That kind of upsets the mix. The recipe doesn't work. But if you have a horror movie that really does deliver on the horror elements, but then have the comedy come not from making fun of horror, but having characters that are funny, that can make commentary on the horrific situations, that's where the real, or irony, you know, situations that have ironic elements that are fuel from the horror tropes, then it works.
Horror comedy movies have been around since the dawn of film, so of course you didn't have to wait around until 1986 to see one in the 80s. Student Bodies, The Stuff, Once Bitten, The Toxic Avenger, these all blended horror and comedy elements to one degree or another.
Likewise, Larry Cohen's The Stuff is another one. Are you eating it, or is it eating you? What a great tagline. What a great tagline. So much fun. And I think that's one of the things that you usually go back to the movies that are the most fun to watch.
But as you go through the 80s genre output, it seems like things got sillier and more outrageous as the decade passed, building up to a horror comedy explosion in 1986. This is the year when producers decided we needed not just one, but 3 separate horror movies set on April Fool's Day. There was Slaughter High, Killer Party, and the one that was actually able to use the title, April Fool's Day. All 3 have a comedic edge to them, and each one leans into the pranks and goofiness of the date that they're set on. Slaughter High has a man in a jester mask seeking revenge on the bullies whose prank went terribly wrong. He stalks them through the halls of their old high school, which is somehow fully equipped with bedrooms and a bathtub. Killer Party starts out by pranking the audience, giving us 2 fake-out opening sequences. One is set at a funeral home, the other is set at a drive-in and becomes a music video. Then we get to the actual story about possession and murder on a college campus. April Fool's Day is the best and most entertaining of the bunch, gathering a bunch of college students, including Amy Steele from Friday the 13th Part 2, together on a private island. It soon appears that a killer has set out to murder everybody. The climactic twist seems to be the dividing line that decides whether or not a person is a fan of this movie. Some hate the twist and feel that it invalidates everything that came before it. Others, like myself, feel like it's the perfect wrap-up. The ending makes this movie truly unique amongst 80s slashers and more satisfying than it would have been otherwise. It gives a reason for all the kills being off screen. And if you can't laugh along with the twist and be entertained as the characters party to Three Dog Night, well, I'm sorry that you don't like fun. '86 saw Trauma follow The Toxic Avenger with Class of Nukem High. Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner went on a haunted honeymoon. There was the hodgepodge mess of a cult favorite called Spookies. We got the From Dusk Till Dawn precursor Vamp, where Chris Makepeace from Meatballs and Getty Watanabe from 16 Candles go to a strip club, which turns out to be infested with vampires, including an otherworldly Grace Jones. Future Full Moon founder Charles Band brought us Troll with Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Sonny Bono, paving the way for the infamous sequel in name only, Troll 2, which by the way, Band had nothing to do with. He was, however, responsible for the wild alien invasion via satellite television movie Terror Vision. This is packed with memorable, ridiculous dialogue. Speaking of alien invasions, this is the year when the Krites, that's critters to you and me, first visited our planet. Steve Miner brought us the comedic haunted house movie House, which was followed by an even more comedic sequel the next year, House 2: The Second Story. Fred Decker wrote the story for House and also wrote and directed Night of the Creeps, which sent the legendary Tom Atkins after zombie college kids who rise from the dead under the influence of alien slugs. If there's one person you can count on to scare the hell out of you, it's the literary master of horror, Stephen King. He even showed up on screen in the trailer for his sole directorial effort, Maximum Overdrive, so that he could promise what to do what you expect him to.
I'm gonna scare the hell out of you.
Yeah. Maximum Overdrive doesn't exactly do that. Admittedly, fueled by copious amounts of alcohol and cocaine, King made a movie that splashes a whole lot of goofball insanity across the screen. Getting viewers to be afraid of sentient big rigs would have been a tall order for any filmmaker. But there are a few moments in Maximum Overdrive that try to be unnerving at least. I remember seeing this on TNT back in the day and being very bothered at this scene where the kid gets run over by a steamroller. At that time in my life, I had always assumed that kids were off limits in horror movies. And most of the film is a display of dopey characters, amusing dialogue, and hammy acting, including an opening scene cameo by King himself that really sets the tone for what's to follow. One of my favorite movies of '86, actually one of my favorite movies period, is Trick or Treat. Starring Mark Price, you might know him as Skippy from Family Ties, with appearances by Gene Simmons and Ozzy Osbourne. This one is a must-watch every October. It follows teenage outcast heavy metal fan Eddie, whose rock idol, Sammy Kerr, dies in a fire. But then Eddie discovers that he can communicate with Sammy's spirit by playing his last album backwards. There are some dark, unnerving scenes as Eddie interacts with Sammy from the afterlife, gradually realizing that his hero is an evil being who can't be trusted. Then Sammy is able to physically re-enter our world, and when he starts zapping people with his electrical powers, we're not exactly in full-on horror territory anymore. The movie awesomely goes off the rails. This was the year that we got a musical adaptation of Roger Corman's 1960 horror film, The Little Shop of Horrors, with Rick Moranis in the lead, Steve Martin as a sadistic dentist, and appearances by John Candy and Bill Murray. Roger Corman's wife, Julie, contributed to the horror comedy proliferation by producing Chopping Mall, a Jim Wynorski joint with prominent roles for genre regulars Barbara Crampton and Kelly Maroney. This one was the same wish fulfillment setup as Dawn of the Dead. It follows a group of characters who have an entire shopping mall to themselves outside of business hours. Unfortunately for them, this mall has top-of-the-line security. A trio of robots patrol the place, zooming around on their tank treads. They're supposed to be non-lethal guards who will neutralize burglars with sleep darts and tasers. But when a lightning strike fries their computer system, the robots turn homicidal. They proceed to hunt down the trespassers, electrocuting them, shooting them with laser beams, blowing their heads up, and telling their corpses to have a nice day. It's a blast. Any day where you can spend 77 minutes watching Chopping Mall is a nice one. '86 was also the year the horror comedy approach infiltrated two major franchises with glorious results. We'll start with a movie that I owe my horror fandom to, Friday the 13th Part 6, Jason Lives. I was only 3 years old when this movie hit VHS, but I still remember the day my teenage sister came home with her then boyfriend and rented a copy of Jason Lives. When they put the movie on, I sat down to watch it with them. Things started out fine, but when a lightning bolt resurrected iconic slasher Jason Voorhees, and he rose from his grave, putting on his hockey mask and starting his latest killing spree, I freaked the fuck out. Since I was screaming and crying, they had to stop the movie and leave to go watch it at the boyfriend's place. But despite my negative reaction, I was hooked. I wanted to know what was going to happen next. I had my mom rent us our own copy of Jason Lives just so I could give it another try, and this is how horror became my favorite genre. Writer-director Tom McLaughlin brought a great sense of humor to his Jason movie. Tasked with bringing the slasher back from the dead, he took the Frankenstein route. And that's just one of the several film references and homages in the movie. There's a self-referential crack from a character who's seen enough horror movies to know that any weirdo wearing a mask is never friendly. And a drunken caretaker who breaks the fourth wall to note, "Some folks have a strange idea of entertainment." There are nods to Sean Cunningham, John Carpenter, Mick Garris, and Boris Karloff, and even a parody of the James Bond gun barrel sequence, with Jason standing in for 007. There are amusing moments throughout the film, but despite the extra level of humor around him, the character of Jason is always taken seriously. He's always a dangerous element in a scene, never the butt of the joke. And this allows for some stalking scenes that are effectively suspenseful. Jason's played by CJ Graham this time around and racks up a high body count in the film, slashing his way through everyone that comes through during his journey from the cemetery, back to his home turf of Camp Crystal Lake, which is now up and running again under the name Camp Forest Green. But critics like Siskel and Ebert had made such a big deal about the violence in these films that the ratings board cracked down on them. At this point, not much gore could make it to the screen. So when you combine the quickness of the kills and the lower level of bloodshed with the humor, not to mention a lack of nudity, it actually makes Jason Lives a decent gateway horror film for kids looking to get into the genre. It could be the next step beyond movies like Gremlins and The Monster Squad. Or if you're like me, you could just dive right into this one. It's well written and clever. It features some good acting and strong leads in Tom Matthews as Tommy Jarvis, a character who returns from the previous two Fridays, and Jennifer Cook as his love interest Megan. It also sports some of the best cinematography and production value of any film in the franchise. The shot of Jason standing on top of a burning RV wreckage is one of the greatest images we've ever seen of the character. Thanks to Jason Lives, I started renting my way through the horror section of the local video stores. As a preschooler, I was already a fan of the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2, an '86 release that perfectly balances its over-the-top humor with a strange horror atmosphere. Director Tobe Hooper had seen the first film as a dark comedy. As it gained a reputation for being one of the scariest, most disturbing films ever made, he was disappointed that so few people pointed out the humor in it. So when he directed the sequel, he intended to make the humor much more obvious. He and writer L.M. Kit Carson definitely succeeded at that. And Bill Moseley helped with his insane performance as a character named Chop Top. Most chainsaw movies deal with young people on a road trip. This one shines by taking a different approach. The young people on the road are the first victims, murdered by the chainsaw-wielding Leatherface, but they happen to be on the phone with a radio DJ called Stretch at the time. And the sound of them being killed has been recorded by the radio station. This gets Stretch, played by Carolyn Williams, mixed up with Dennis Hopper's character Lefty, a former Texas Ranger and the vengeful uncle of characters from Part 1. And when Leatherface and Chop Top come busting into the radio station, this also becomes a story of unrequited love. Leatherface has a major crush on Stretch, and I mean, who can blame him? When Stretch and Lefty follow the killers to their lair, built in tunnels under an abandoned amusement park, it's like a descent into hell. The set design is spectacular, and these sets are dressed with an impossible amount of human remains. These characters have apparently killed enough people to populate a small country. This is the logic of haunted houses and nightmares. It's like a visual representation of the killer's twisted mind. But while Chainsaw 2 is brutal, gory, and disturbing, Its character interactions are hilarious, especially when we see Jim Sidow's Cook character dealing with his brothers Leatherface and Chop Top, or when Stretch tells Leatherface that their relationship just won't work, giving cliche, "it's nobody's fault" breakup lines. The movie's sense of humor is divisive, but I think it's brilliant. I loved it as a 4-year-old, I love it even more as an adult now that I have a better understanding of the jokes. There were more horror comedies to come in the remaining years of the 80s, including franchise entries that upped the comedy element. 1987 brought the gleefully hilarious Evil Dead 2, the Elm Street films got increasingly humorous, with Freddy Krueger dropping one-liners for every kill, Phantasm got a sequel with laughs and a 4-barrel shotgun, and Sleepaway Camp got a couple of comedic follow-ups. If you wanted your horror to be deadly serious, there were still options to choose from. But if you enjoyed horror comedies, there were also many laughs to be had. What do you think of the horror comedies of the 1980s? Does the humor in movies like Jason Lives and Chainsaw 2 work for you? Let us know by leaving a comment, because we want to know all about your 80s horror memories.
I strongly suggest that any filmmaker who wants to make a horror movie respect the audience. They are very smart. They love what the genre brings and what it does for them, so honor them. And then if you use that as your foundation, you can do all kinds of really interesting things, because horror is psychology. So you can do anything and plug any different character or situation as long as you respect that base. So a little tip from an old man.
On the next episode, stop your grinning and drop your linen, because we're gonna nuke the site with aliens. Until next time, gore hounds.
Game over, man. It's game over.
Hi friends, your humble narrator Tyler Nichols here, and I hope that you enjoyed that episode of 80s Horror Memories. If you missed our previous episode, click over here. If you want to see more from our series, click up here. And if you're not subscribed yet, what are you doing? Subscribe right here. And most importantly, stay spooky, folks.